Start with the vehicle on flat, level ground. Make sure the vehicle is in gear or park and the front wheels are chalked. If working on the ground, raise vehicle up and place frame on jack stands. Support axle with jack stands. We will be using a lift in order to more clearly show the installation steps. Remove rear wheels and tires. Support the axle. Remove the lower shock bolts using an 18mm socket and wrench. Remove the sway bar end links with an 18mm socket and wrench for the lower bolt and an 18mm wrench and 6mm Allen key for the upper stud. The 6mm Allen is to prevent the stud from spinning. These will be reused on the front, so be sure to save them. With the grinder and cutoff wheel, cut the welds in the factory lower shock brackets. Remove the shock brackets and grind the welds clean. Do not cut off the sway bar link tabs. Install the rear shock relocation brackets on the axle in the highest position. Use the original sway bar mounting bolt and nut to hold the bracket on. If at some point the owner wants to return to stock, this mount can be used in place of the factory mount for factory shock location. Install a 5/16 inch nut, bolt, and washer in the upper bracket hole. The washer goes on the outside under the bolt head. It's easiest to hold the nuts with a box end wrench on the back side and turn the bolts as they go through the brackets and catch the nut. Hand tighten the upper 5/16 inch bolt at this time. With the bracket loosely installed, mark and center punch the third bolt hole down on the bracket from your top bolt. Remove the bracket and pilot drill the previously marked hole with a 1/8 inch drill bit. Then use an 11 32 inch drill bit to finish the hole. Paint any bare metal surfaces to help prevent rust. Remove the two bolts holding the driver's side rear sway bar bracket to the frame using a 15mm socket. Discard the hardware. Loosen, but do not remove the hardware holding the passenger side rear sway bar bracket to the frame. The sway bar should be loose and able to move. Install a spacer block in between the driver's side frame and the sway bar bracket. Loosely install the provided hardware with a washer under the bolt head. Remove the passenger side bracket from frame and discard hardware. Install a spacer block in between the passenger side frame and sway bar bracket. Loosely install the provided hardware and a washer under the bolt head. Make sure the brackets and sway bar are centered. Torque the mounting hardware to 35 foot-pounds using a 17mm socket. Install a single lower bump stop spacer through the forward hole on the stock bump stop pads. Torque hardware to 35 foot-pounds. Now install a cap on each of the bump stop spacers for a total of 2 inches of bump stop spacing. The cap can be snapped onto the lower spacer with a mallet or a large pry bar. Remove the brake line bracket from the axle with a 10mm wrench. Loosen, but do not remove the frame side and axle side track bar bolts using a 21mm socket. Loosen, but do not remove all the control arm hardware. This includes the axle side and the frame side. If the vehicle is a Rubicon model, remove the rear locker wiring harness from the differential. Remove the parking brake cables from the caliper and tabs on the axle. Since we are using a lift, we will be lowering the axle, which is supported by a transmission jack with an adapter. Lower the axle far enough to remove the rear springs and upper isolators. Be very careful not to damage any brake lines or electrical lines. Install the upper isolators on the Synergy springs. Install the Synergy rear springs, making sure the upper isolators are properly seated. There is a nub on the top upper spring isolator that must fit into a hole in the spring perch on the frame. With the springs in place, raise the axle back up to prevent them from falling out. Replace the jack stands under the axle. After allowing the paint to dry, bolt the shock relocation brackets back onto the control arm mounts with the provided hardware. Bolts should be installed from the back forward with a washer under the bolt head and the serrated flange nut on the inside of the control arm brackets. Leave the bolts slightly loose. Install the Synergy sway bar links. The tie rod end goes into the sway bar with the nut on the inside of the bar towards the frame. The bushing end of the link attaches to the axle just as the stock end link on the outside of the axle tab towards the wheel or the tire. It may be necessary to use a 14mm open-end wrench on the flats on the studs to prevent the stud from turning while tightening the nut. Torque the sway bar link hardware. Torque lower bolts to 60 foot-pounds and upper nut to 50 foot-pounds. Tighten the jam nut with a 19mm wrench, using an 18mm wrench to hold the tie rod end. Torque the shock mount bracket 5/16" bolts to 20 foot-pounds. Install the shocks, using the original lower shock hardware and torque to 74 foot-pounds. Reinstall the brake line brackets, locker wiring, and parking brake cables. Now we move on to the front of the vehicle. Remove the front wheels and tires. Remove the sway bar end links with an 18mm socket and wrench for the lower bolt, and an 18mm wrench and a 6mm Allen key for the upper stud. Repeat these steps for the driver's side to move the bar out of the way. Loosen, but do not remove the frame side and axle side track bar bolts using a 21mm socket. Loosen, but do not remove all control arm hardware. Remove the heat shield bolt and bend them up and out of the way to access these bolts. Remove the brake line brackets from the lower control arms and coil mounts using a 15mm socket and a 10mm socket. Disconnect the electrical plug from the front axle disconnect. Loosen wiring by removing zip ties and clips. If the vehicle is a Rubicon model, remove the front locker harness from the differential. Remove the lower shock bolts with an 18mm socket, and remove shocks from axle side bracket. Since we are using a lift, we will be lowering the axle, which is supported by a transmission jack with an adapter. With axle fully lowered, remove the stock springs. Pay close attention to orientation of upper spring isolators. Do not remove from the bump stop tube. Remove the lower spring isolators. These are hard plastic and clip to the axle. Install the Synergy sway bar relocation brackets. Brackets are not right-left specific, and they have a radius to accommodate the axle tube. Insert relocation brackets in between the stock axle side sway bar link brackets and the coil mounts. Loosely install an M12 bolt through the spring perch and the Synergy sway bar link relocation bracket. Use a washer under the head of the bolt and under the nut. It may be necessary to tap the brackets into place with a mallet. Loosely install an M12 bolt through the stock sway bar mount and the Synergy sway bar link relocation bracket. Use a washer under the head of the bolt and under the nut. With both pieces of hardware installed, tighten and torque to 70 foot-pounds. Install the new Synergy lower spring isolators. Install the new Synergy springs, being careful to ensure the upper spring isolators are correctly oriented. There is a nub on the top of the upper spring isolator that must fit into a hole in the spring perch on the frame. The flat end of the spring is the bottom. With the springs in place, raise the axle back up to prevent them from falling out. Install a single lower bump stop spacer through the hole in the center of the axle side spring pad. We installed the bump stop spacer pucks through the coils after it was installed. The passenger side can only be accessed from the rear. Accessing the driver's side nut can be done from either the front or the back of the spring perch. Torque hardware to 35 foot-pounds. Install a cap on each of the bump stop spacers for a total of 2 inches of bump stop spacing. With a little effort, they can be snapped into place using a pry bar and mallet. Install the new front lower shock extensions inside the stock OEM shock mounts on the axle. The upper mounting ears go forward. Then install the 1-inch bolt and washer up from the bottom and top lock nut and washer on top. Loosely install the 3-inch long bolt, 2 washers, and a top lock nut through the stock shock eyelet on the axle mounts. Torque all the shock extension bolts at this point. 5/16 inch hardware torque to 20 foot-pounds. 1/2 inch hardware torque to 35 foot-pounds. Repeat for the other side. Install the sway bar end links removed from the rear of the vehicle in the front with factory hardware. The bushing end of the link attaches to the axle on the inside of the tab towards the center of the vehicle. It may be necessary to use a 6mm Allen key to prevent the upper stud from spinning. Torque lower bolts to 60 foot-pounds and upper nuts to 50 foot-pounds. Raise the axle up, or lower the vehicle down so the shocks fit into the mounting brackets. Bolt the shocks into the upper mounting ears. Reuse the OEM shock bolts and torque to 74 foot-pounds. Reinstall the brake line brackets, front axle disconnect, and locker wiring, if so equipped. Reinstall the wheels and tires, and put the vehicle back on the ground. Make sure the suspension is settled by rocking it back and forth carefully. Torque track bar hardware to 90 foot-pounds. Torque lower control arm hardware to 190 foot-pounds. Torque upper control arm hardware to 80 foot-pounds. Torque track bar hardware to 90 foot-pounds. Torque the lower control arm hardware to 90 foot-pounds. Torque the upper control arm frame side bolts to 120 foot-pounds and axle side hardware to 95 foot-pounds. Be sure to check all bolt torques after approximately 100 miles of driving and after each trip off-road.